Hello and welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, as always, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you?
Positively splendid, Gary. I hope you are the same.
Fantastic. I'm roasting here, sweating in Cork, Ireland, far more than I was in Portugal due to this lack of air conditioning that we have, and I'm sure you're the same.
Well, London is very, very warm, but at least all my windows can be open, so there's a nice breeze. And my flat is like shaded in the early part of the day, and then gets absolutely blasted out of it in the afternoon. So it's the early part of the day now, so there's still some shade.
Very good. And today we're talking about strength. Okay, we're continuing the How to Train series. And in the last one, what we talked about was muscle building and hypertrophy, or bodybuilding. So that's obviously one category of strength sports or ways that people might use resistance training, where they're trying to maximize muscle mass. However, in this episode, what we're talking about is a something that looks very similar to the average person training for strength, okay, but is actually quite different when it comes to the specifics of programming. So there's significant crossover, but there are definitely more specific considerations when it comes to training for strength, and then more specific again if you're training for powerlifting. And this is an important point because strength is simply task specific force production. That's what it is. So we could talk about strength in the context of you being, for example, someone that does moving, helping people move houses, and you lift fridges and you lift sinks and whatever else. Okay, that could be what we're talking about in terms of strength. But most often, when it comes to the gym, what we're talking about is the ability to lift as much weight as possible with specific or applied to specific exercises. So, for example, squat strength, overhead press strength, deadlift strength, pull-up strength, and so on. Most of the time, we end up talking about that in the context of a one rep max, probably because it's so related to one, you being able to lift as much as possible, and everyone wants to see where their limit is. But then two, because of the sport of powerlifting, they test one rep max. But you could also talk about your 3 rep max strength, your 5 rep max strength, and these might be more relevant for different populations. So the first opening point that's really important is that it's task specific, and you can think of strength in terms of your own goals. So you might be training for strength even if you're not a powerlifter and even if you're not trying to test your 1 rep max.
Yeah, and the really difficult thing about strength, especially when we talk about like a programming discussion, it's both generalized and specific in terms of if you want to just strengthen your pecs, right? Those pressing muscles, in your chest, right? It's generalized in terms of if you get a stronger dumbbell bench press, stronger chest press, stronger bench press, there's a degree of carryover between all of them because it's the same muscles, it's roughly the same movement pattern. Cool, right? So there's a generalizable aspect to it. And obviously, some exercises, some movements, some whatever have greater carryover to different movements, whatever, right? But there's also a very specific aspect to it as well. Just because you get stronger pecs, stronger pressing muscles, triceps, shoulders, etc., from doing a chest press, doesn't mean that you're going to maximize your ability on the bench press. There is a there is some carryover, there is a degree of generalized carryover, but it may not be specific enough to improve your actual bench press because we have to remember that there is a large degree of technique involved in lifting. You think, oh, it's just lifting weights. It's just go in and lift the weights. It's not a big deal, right? But it is a very technical sport when we're talking about powerlifting, right? Like it's heavy loads and you have to be so accurate with the way you actually move those loads, right? Because first of all, there's a large injury risk, especially if you're doing like a 1 rep max, but also you're not going to maximize your force output if there's a load of extra movements, elbows flaring all over the place, shoulders moving, whatever. You're not going to maximize your force production, right? So there's that in an exercise sense, it's specific, but also it's specific in terms of the exact loading parameters. If you are if you improve your, I don't know, let's say your 8 rep max on the bench press, there is a generalized carryover to improving your 1 rep max. But if you never practice 1 rep maxes, you're not going to develop the skill of expressing that 1 rep max, right? Now, that's not to say that if all we really care about is our 1 rep max, or all we really care about is our 8 rep max, or whatever it is, that's the only thing that we train, that's not to say that you do have to train that specific. Like if it's a 1 rep max you want to improve, you do have to train for singles basically. But you also get some generalized carryover from training other rep ranges, and training other rep ranges might make more logistical sense in terms of you can get more practice with the movement. You can maybe build specific muscle in specific areas, and like there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't necessarily always just do why you wouldn't always train the way you intend to compete, right? So again, it's strength is specific, or sorry, let's start again. Strength is generalized. There's a large carryover. It's specific to the exercises, but it's also specific to the exact loading parameters, whether it's the rep range or number of sets. Like you might want to improve your 5 rep max across 5 sets. That's both a strength and an absolute strength thing in terms of your 5 rep max strength, and then also an endurance aspect because you want to do it for multiple sets. So there's a lot of components to this is basically what I'm trying to say. And that can make it difficult when we're actually trying to program for this stuff, because like Gary said, we're talking today about improving strength, and a lot of people, when they think of strength, they really think of lower rep ranges, and they generally, if we're talking about a gym setting, they think of the powerlifting movements. They're like, oh, it's the squat, the bench, the deadlift. But you could also do the same things for your chin up, your front squat, your hip thrust, your like any other movement. Now, why would you do that? That's ultimately the crux of the issue. A lot of that is unnecessary, and again, oftentimes, and we've said it previously on the podcast multiple times, but oftentimes people train the power lifts when they're not actually the best movement for the job that person is trying to actually accomplish, right? So very specific, very generalized. The discussion is very convoluted. So how do we start the programming discussion, Gary?
Yeah, so the thing I'd like to mention first and foremost when it comes to beginning to train strength is that when you train for muscle building, your focus is on trying to stimulate the muscle as much as possible. So what you're primarily trying to achieve is some sort of internal stimulus that leads to an adaptation within the muscle. When you train for strength, what you're trying to do is to be as efficient as possible. It's kind of the opposite to training for hypertrophy, even though you can get hypertrophy while training for strength. Because training for hypertrophy, you're actually trying to be inefficient. So we often do things, for example, if we're doing chin-ups, we might use certain cues to try to focus more on the lats. So we want to squeeze our lats, we want to feel the muscles working. If you're training for strength, you actually don't want that at all. You just want to be as efficient as possible. So it might actually work your lats a little bit less, but you're able to do more weight. You see that in the difference between how someone might bench press, let's say, for maximal strength, where they might arch their back as much as possible, reduce the range of motion as much as possible, take a super wide grip, and they're actually trying to reduce the range of motion, they're trying to reduce the total demand on the pecs, and just maximize the amount of weight they can lift. So that's something that's really important to differentiate here, is we're aiming at efficiency, we're aiming at performance. We're not necessarily aiming at the internal stimulus, despite the fact that they are related. So what this means is that when you begin to approach strength training, you adopt a technique that maximizes your efficiency. So for example, you might do a low bar back squat, squatting to parallel or just an inch below to move as efficiently as possible, but you mightn't feel your quads work as much when you do that versus when you do a really deep high bar back squat or a really deep front squat. So in the second context there, you're maximizing range of motion, you're trying to get a deep stretch in the quads, you have an internal focus on the quads. Whereas with the strength example, you're just trying to move as much weight as possible, as efficiently as possible, regardless of the internal stimulus on the muscle. This is a very key difference because it determines how you perform the exercises that you perform. Most programs will feature both internally focused exercises where there's a hypertrophy component and those that are more force production focused where we're trying to move the most amount of weight. A lot of people probably need a little bit of both. If you're a bodybuilder, you're going to be more towards the internal side, and if you're a powerlifter, you're going to be more towards the performance or strength expression side. Okay, so that's the first thing. Anything to add on that point?
No, not a huge amount. And just practically speaking, like when you talk about this, like internal versus external focus, like say, for example, in a bodybuilding context, it might be a case of you still have an internal focus, like you're still trying to maximize the tension on, again, your pecs or whatever muscle it is. But you don't mind if you don't feel that as much. You don't mind if, there is a bit of, you know, oh, I'm kind of just going through the movement. If that movement is an externally focused movement, like you might be like, right, this is just a high output movement. It's not great for any specific thing, like we'll just say like a bench press or something. It's like it's not great for overall pec development for a lot of people, but it's a good standardizable movement that I can just put a lot of force into, put a lot of output into. So you still have this kind of mix of internal and external cues where you're just like, the main focus is really improving my strength on this exercise. I don't care if that means that I don't feel it as much, and that's the goal, the external focus. And then the rest of your movements, you might have a very like internal focus, being like, I'm really squeezing, I'm really making sure everything is lined up perfectly, etc. Right? Whereas for powerlifting or like strength specific stuff, you might have less of that internal focus. Like the overall focus is on, well, I really only care about the somewhat arbitrary standards that are set by my powerlifting federation, being like, this is how low I have to squat. These are the these are the rules of the deadlift. These are the rules of the bench press. Which again, like take the bench press for example. Like if it was all about absolute strength, you wouldn't have to pause at the bottom of a bench press. You would just touch and go. Same with kind of deadlifts to an extent. Like obviously you can do more, like basically bouncing the bar off the ground. So you could technically argue that, oh well, if you were able to walk the deadlift out, take one step back and then bounce it off the ground, like start with the eccentric phase first and then do the concentric, like you'd be able to lift more a lot of the time, right? So the standards, what we're actually trying to aim for, again, as I was saying earlier, it's very specific. We have to be very clear on what we're actually trying to improve, because that dictates obviously the way we compete if it is powerlifting, but also the way we train. We have to make sure that we are actually training the right attributes.
That just reminds me of what, like, I wonder why there's never been any federation that's done like the monolift version of the deadlift, where like a squat, you lift up, they move the rack out, and then you do the eccentric and the concentric. I'd be interested in seeing that, see if there'd be any difference in the world records. But anyway,
The movement was just arbitrarily,
yeah,
they were based on what equipment was able to be, done. It's like, oh, strength standard here, like what can you pick up off the ground, right? That's a good general, like, oh, well, this is the good strength. But who the fuck decided on the radius, or well, the diameter obviously, but the radius of the plates, because that dictates the height at which you deadlift, like that's why, like, say strongman, they use like the wagon wheel type things, it's like, well, if that was just the standard, that's now the standard, so like it's all just arbitrary, well, largely arbitrary. Same with like bench height, like who the fuck decided like the height of the bench? It doesn't work for tall lifters, like it just doesn't, right? Like my knee is way above the bench in general, whereas this little small person comes in, they're like, yeah, I don't have to care about like my toes being on the floor versus my heels or whatever, because their knee is below the fucking bench regardless. So it's all just arbitrary.
and that brings us to practicing the actual skill, because this is very much related to what I just talked about. So you need to practice the skill of lifting heavy weights. So these are different skills. So what you'll notice very frequently, if you've done programming that features different rep ranges, is that within the first couple of weeks of doing a new rep range, you see fairly rapid increases in the weight that you're lifting on the bar. And this is because lifting within different rep ranges has slightly different strength qualities. So if you were to go from doing sets of 10 to 15 to doing sets of, let's say, 3 to 5, on the first week, it's probably going to feel really weird to you doing the sets of 3 to 5. And your estimated 1 rep max with the 3 to 5 rep weight might actually go down versus what you were doing in the 10 to 15 range. However, over subsequent weeks, you'll see fairly rapid increases in the weight that you're lifting. And it's not necessarily that you've had any massive changes within your muscle. It's that you've improved your skill considerably and gotten used to the requirements of lifting that percentage of your 1 rep max. So it's very different, because when people lift out a weight, let's say that's 60% of their 1 rep max, they take it out pretty casually, they bring it down slowly, they press it up. Like there's a bit of effort, but they don't have to really focus on bracing as hard as they can, breathing at the right time, getting their elbows in the right position, having strong wrists, if we're talking about the bench press, and so on. So as you begin to develop all of those things, you're able to express more of the strength that you already inhabit. So that's really important. So what this means then in practice is that,
Sorry, just also on that, like there's a load of like very specific things that you also do. Like say for the bench press, for example, like you have to unrack the bar, you have to bring it over the chest, you know. So if you only ever do like, yeah, well, say continuous reps, like you do 3 sets of 8 reps, let's just say, right? You only practice that 3 times. Versus if you were to do singles every single time, like unracking the bar, stabilizing it, make sure it's in the right place, everything, like you've practiced that one component way more. You know, same with squatting. If you have to walk the bar out or whatever, or if it's a whatever you call those things, the fucking things,
monolith.
the clasp stuff. Yeah, yeah. Like if you've never practiced that, or you only do continuous reps, like you forget that that's actually a skill. You know, you have to make sure you're bracing, make sure you're ready for that. You have to unrack the bar. You have to do everything specifically. So if you need to practice that as well as practice the actual skill of lifting the weights, you know?
Absolutely. So that is really important. And what that looks like then in practice is you getting regular exposure to heavier weights. So for example, the bulk of your training might be done, let's say, in the 5 to 8 rep range on average, but you're getting that exposure to the 1 to 3 rep range relatively regularly. So for example, you might want to be lifting close to your max all the time, but you might have one day per week where you do a single at RPE 7 to 8 or 2 to 3 reps in reserve. So what you're doing is maybe around your 3 rep max, you're doing it for 1 rep, and then you're getting exposure to 85 to 90% at least of your 1 rep max. And now you're maintaining those adaptations. So even if you were doing a hypertrophy block of training where you're doing higher reps, you're still getting exposure to these lower rep exposures. So just training for strength, even if you're training for a 1 rep max, it doesn't mean you need to do it all the time. It doesn't mean every set needs to be 1 to 3, but you need to have regular exposures. So that is really important. And getting those exposures at slightly lower RPE, so it could be between 6 and 8, let's say, not going all the way to failure and testing your 1 rep max really regularly, allows you to practice that skill without the excessive fatigue that would come if you were testing your 1 rep max very regularly. Okay. Now, this obviously becomes more important then as you move closer to a competition period or a deadline where you need to express your strength. So if you have a powerlifting competition coming up during your peaking phase, you're typically going to have lower reps on average than if you were further away during a hypertrophy block. So at that point in time, you're going to have more regular exposures of this maximal force production. And even if you're not doing very, very heavy weights, you might even still stick with lower reps with lighter weights. So for example, you might be using your 5 to 7 rep max and still just doing 1 to 3 reps to focus on speed, to focus on positioning, and to just focus on those 1 rep exposures. Another example of where this would come up would be even when people are doing their deadlifts as powerlifters, sometimes they'll do the concentric, drop it really quickly, and then reset so that they're making every rep similar in terms of skill and requirements as the eventual exposure that they're training for, which is the 1 rep max. So they're resetting between reps rather than doing them continuously. So how specific you're going to be here depends on how far you are from competition and how specific you actually need to be. If you're a general trainee trying to get stronger, maybe you just generally want to lift more weights over time, you don't need to worry too much about getting the regular like 1 rep max or 1 rep exposures, but you might want to get exposure in that 1 to 3 rep range at least at some point in the week over time. Again, it doesn't have to be to failure. We would say that for strength generally, the kind of RPE or reps in reserve recommendations end up being somewhat similar to hypertrophy training on average. So maybe like 1 to 3, 1 to 4 reps in reserve most of the time. But I would say that with my strength trainees, I often end up using slightly different techniques in terms of more sets of low reps or of more reps in reserve. So for example, it could be 4 to 5 reps in reserve for more sets. Let's say it was just sets of 3. So 3 reps at 4 to 5 RIR by even like 5 to 7 sets sometimes. Because the goal there is that if I'm trying to get my client to focus on developing their technique and get this exposure without their technique degrading, then that's a really specific way of me being able to do that. Because if you're doing all sets of 8, let's say, to failure, then sets 5 to 8 are actually very different, or reps 5 to 8, I should say, look very different to what your 1 rep max rep would look like if you were just doing that in isolation. So sometimes doing more sets, lower reps, and a little bit further from failure can allow someone to just really focus in on each rep and maintain the skill and the quality of their rep.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing to understand about all of these. It's the skill. Like, you are practicing a skill here. It's not testing. It's not seeing going in, going like, I wonder what my 1 rep max is today. Has it gone up? That's what a lot of people think powerlifting training is, right? It's also not just like, oh, I'm going to have to train like lower reps and all of those sets are going to be as close to failure as possible. Like, I'm going to do 3 sets of 3 or something. They're all like 90% or more of my 1 rep max, it's basically just skill. It's skill acquisition, skill maintenance, and skill potentiation. And to kind of put this into a more practical or like visual thing, like let's just say you've always trained more of a bodybuilding type, training program. Let's say you do 4 days per week. I would say that's probably most people's exposure. They've trained 3-4 days per week in some sort of like more bodybuilding kind of way. Now, again, refer back to the last episode, I think it was the last episode anyway, about how to set that up better. But let's just take that general framework. If you were really like, right, I want to actually focus a little bit more on like specific strength. I want to maybe think about transitioning into powerlifting, or think about, seeing where my 1 rep max strength actually is on these movements. A very simple change, if we're thinking about this from a skill acquisition point of view, is all we would have to change is maybe start bringing in some lower rep work, still with kind of like that, 1 to 4 to 5 even reps in reserve, right? So let's say, you do a lower body day, an upper body day, a lower body day, an upper body day. That's the way your 4-day per week program looks, right? Let's just say you change nothing else about the general setup of that, except your first lower body day, you do the squat, right? And that squat you do, let's just start with 1 set, right? You're doing 1 set of a heavy weight. Let's just say it's 90%. So you could probably do, 3 reps or so with that weight. You're just going to do 1 single, right? So just 1 set, 1 single with that, but you're going to treat that set as if it is a 1 rep max. You're going in mentally, setting up, everything's perfect. You're bracing from the start. You're practicing the movement, taking the bar, unracking it, everything, right? You're making sure it's perfect, right? Your technique, perfect, everything, right? And then the second upper body day, then you're doing that with the bench press, right? So again, you're doing one rep. That's all, right? It's about 90% of your 1 rep max, or what you perceive or what you think your 1 rep max is, because everyone always overinflates. They're like, oh yeah, I could definitely do 3 plates. There's that whole discussion as well. But anyway, right, it's about 90%. So you still have, 2, maybe 3 reps in the tank with this. You're just practicing. It's a heavy enough weight. I'm practicing for that 1 rep max. And then on the second lower body day, you do it with the deadlift. You just go, okay, I'm going in, I'm practicing my deadlift. I'm still setting it up as if it's 90%, but I'm treating this as if it's a 1 rep max. And then that second upper body day, you do the bench press again, because a lot of people do find they need a little bit more frequency of, practicing the movement with the upper body pressing. And there is also a large degree of carryover between the squat, especially a kind of more lower bar squat, and the deadlift, right? So there's a large degree of carryover. So if we did nothing else except change this general 4-day per week bodybuilding program, and we just introduced 1 set of 90% of your 1 rep max for 1 rep, right, on those movements as described, right? That would give you a taste of what it's like to train more in a kind of powerlifting specific manner. Now, is that how you optimize your powerlifting training? Absolutely not. But that would kind of give you a taste. And that's something that I do a lot of the times, maybe not that exact setup, but a lot of times with clients who are like, you know what, I actually want to just test out my 1 rep max on the bench or something. It's something that I just want to know where I am. I want to hit like, 100 kilo bench press, or, whatever it is, right? They're just like, that's a focus for me. We might bring in a low overall load exposure across the week of that, but we're just going to practice it. We're just going to practice that movement. We're going to spend the next 12 weeks slowly creeping up the other stuff, the general strength, the, strengthening your pecs, getting better in like the 8 rep ranges, the 6 rep ranges, and fucking whatever else, right? But we still need to practice feeling that heavier weight. And then when it comes into, if you're a powerlifter or whatever, like more competition focused time, generally if you're a powerlifter, that won't be the overall setup of your program. But again, using a client as an example, they're like, okay, well, I want to test things in the next 8 weeks. I want to like peak 8 weeks time. I want to be at my max strength. That's when I want to test. Then we might start reducing the overall exposure to like hypertrophy work, that general bodybuilding training that we're doing, and we start doing more sets, more practice sets of those heavier weights, and maybe we start creeping up the weights that we're using in terms of, okay, now we're going to try go to whatever, like if we were doing 3 reps in reserve, now we're going to do 2 reps in reserve. Let's see how you handle that stress. And we're still just doing 1 rep, right? And then we might go, okay, over time, we might go, okay, we're doing 1 rep in reserve. So this is your 2 rep max here, and we're doing it for 1 rep. So this should be very challenging, right? And that kind of gives you a lot of practice with the skill of lifting those heavier weights. Now, that's not how we would set it up for everyone. I just wanted to make it a bit more like practical, like visually, to be like, okay, well, I already do a 4-day per week training program. If I wanted to improve my 1 rep max, what would that look like?
Spot on. And then there are a couple of additional just nuances then when it comes to, for example, rest periods. So how long you rest between sets is generally going to be greater when you're doing strength training, okay? Because what you have to realize is that we're not trying to be short of breath. We're not trying to be sweaty. We're not trying to feel the maximum muscle burn when we're training for strength. We're trying to recover sufficiently between our bouts. So that might be 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, or even more if you're doing very high effort sets, okay? Generally, what you want is that you're able to come back into the next set feeling prepared to go again. You don't want to be in a position where you're still sore or short of breath from the previous set. That's just not effective strength training, and that's going to lead to disproportionate amounts of fatigue and poorer performance on each respective set. So generally speaking, longer rest periods is what you're looking for. And while you could make the argument for very long rest periods in some cases, it becomes quite impractical. So, you might find that 5 to 10 minutes is best for you. You see a lot of powerlifters resting for 10 minutes or even more between sets. But if you're trying to get in a decent amount of volume across the training session, now you're in the gym for 3-4 hours, which some powerlifters will do, but most of our listeners don't have 3-4 hours to be spending in the gym. Okay. So if you were to think of like 1 to 3 minutes as the rest period that covers most people, when it comes to powerlifting, especially your really heavy work, we might see more in the 3 to 5 minute range. I find that with most of my clients, even if they're training for strength, 3 minutes is generally sufficient. But for some of those higher effort sets, we will go a little bit higher. Okay. The other thing on that then is something like tempo. So when we're using tempo for hypertrophy training, we're often trying to choose the tempo that allows the greatest focus on the muscle. So for example, we might do nice and slow, 3 seconds down, pause at the bottom, feel the stretch, and then press up explosively. When it comes to strength, it's actually quite individual, because some people find that a really slow eccentric allows them to maintain their positioning really well, and they're super explosive then on the concentric. Others will be really aggressive with dropping into the hole, like on a squat, for example, and they're able to maintain their positioning. You need to start kind of general. So I would say, let's say on the squat and on the bench press, 2 seconds, maybe 3 seconds on the way down is a good place to start. And then you're changing direction. Obviously, when it comes to the bench press, you have to pause for a fixed period of time. With the squat, you just change direction immediately. Okay. So this is somewhat individual. It's not easy to give rules for everyone, because you'll see vastly different eccentrics among powerlifters. Some will go 3-4 seconds, and some will literally just drop it aggressively onto their chest, or aggressively into the hole on the squat. But I would start with around 2 seconds, maybe 3 seconds, see how it feels, and go from there. Generally, as your technique improves, you'll be able to kind of drop it a little bit faster without sacrificing technique and maintaining your bar path better. But especially early on, I would just be a little bit more controlled and not focus too much on just maximizing weight. Find your technique first, and the strength will come later.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Just on the rest period things, obviously this is going to change based on how strong you are. Like if you're a 300 kilo squatter versus a 30 kilo squatter, like naturally enough, you're probably going to need a little bit more recovery after your 300 kilo squat, So that obviously has to be taken into account. And similarly with like tempo and stuff, it depends on your overall situation. For example, like if you're doing a squat and you have like a a power gut, you have a bit of a belly, like that bottom position in a squat could be, very little actual tension for you. You're basically like trying to close a book on a tennis ball or something, like that's the hip, closing the hip distance or hip angle, So in that bottom position on the squat, you could actually be like, well, I could chill out here. So you having a pause in the bottom position is actually beneficial because you feel like you're doing no work. Now, there is obviously a lot of dissipation of overall energy and stored in tendons and ligaments and fucking whatever else. So it may not be ideal to pause for multiple seconds, but you might find that, okay, I just actually have a pause here and then I'm able to press up squat up a lot more efficiently, right? I just compose myself and then I go. Whereas someone else, maybe if they're very lean, for example, they just find that like staying in that bottom position, especially if it's like a 90-degree, hip angle, shin angle or whatever, like they're able to like very much their thigh is just parallel to the ground and there's no contact between like their hamstring and their calf and there's no contact between their like abs or their stomach and their thighs. They might find that bottom position is like the most challenging position ever because there's absolutely no rest. Conversely, you'll see people like Olympic lifters where they'll squat deep as fuck, right? But at that bottom position, there's actually not a huge amount of tension overall on the muscles because you're at the complete end range of motion. Like your calves are completely covered by your hamstrings, and yeah, you have to still hold the position. There's a lot of core strength. There's a lot of whatever coordination that has to go on. But that position is not actually all that challenging compared to other positions in the movement. So a lot of this is just dictated by your anthropometry, I suppose you'd say, like the way your body is set up. But also when we talk about tempo, we do have to also factor in if you're training for a sport, like on the bench press, for example, in powerlifting, you have to pause the bench. You have to pause it on your chest and you have to wait for that like press command, right? So if you never train for that press command, if you never train that pause, it's going to be a completely different experience than when you do actually go to compete. You're not, like you haven't trained a very integral part of that sport, i.e., the pause on the chest. If you've just always been like, I'm dropping the bar to my chest and basically bouncing it off my chest, like that's a different movement than the bench press that is required for powerlifting. So while there is carryover, obviously you're strengthening similar muscles, it's a similar movement pattern. It's not, as we were saying earlier on, it's not perfectly specific to what you are actually trying to compete in, what you're actually trying to, train for.
So, with all of that said about training for strength, it is important to realize that hypertrophy training does play a strong role in strength. So, while there are considerable neural contributors, meaning that the nervous system plays a really important role in strength output, other things like connective tissue strength, and other like variables like internal moment arms, your own anthropometry, as Paddy was discussing, all these things contribute to your ability to lift a given weight, but your muscle mass does as well. This is really important, okay? The bigger you get over time, the more weight you'll typically be able to lift. So while you can find people that are skinnier than you, people that have less muscle that are stronger, generally speaking, for an individual over time, as they get bigger, they will get stronger. And there comes a point where if you want to maximize your strength, you simply won't get much more out of your current body if you don't gain more muscle mass. Okay, so over time, that's why you will see powerlifters, for example, moving up in weight classes as they struggle to gain strength. So they might kind of top out their ability within a given weight class and then move up by trying to gain more muscle over time. Okay, so you can keep gaining strength without gaining muscle, but there is a limit to that and you need to eventually try to lay down more muscle. So as a result, when people are trying to get stronger, they'll often have periods of time where they're deliberately gaining weight or at least trying to gain muscle. So that obviously involves the dietary side of things, which is kind of beyond the scope of this. But from a training perspective, it involves doing more conventional bodybuilding training with a powerlifting twist. So for example, you might apply all of the things that we discussed in the last podcast, such as doing most of your sets in the 6 to 15 rep range, sticking to between one to four kind of broadly reps in reserve again, doing more sets overall and focusing on some of those internal components. But because you're a powerlifter, what you're going to still do is keep in your work on squat, bench, and deadlift or variations thereof. And also keep focusing on your technique and some of the strength work, like I said previously, with getting those exposure to singles or doubles or triples, for example. So these hypertrophy blocks would be best used when you're further away from a competition or from when you're testing your 1 rep max. So what you wouldn't want to do is say, like, let's say you're not a powerlifter, you're just a general strength trainee. You say to yourself, right, at the end of July, I want to test my 1 rep max and hit a new personal best. So up to that point, I'm going to run a hypertrophy block and then test it. That wouldn't be optimal. You might gain strength, but it's not going to lead to the most specific expression of those qualities. What you'd be better off to do would have been, let's say, maybe from February to April, you run your hypertrophy block. Okay, so you're eating in a calorie surplus, you're training in this more bodybuilding type of fashion, you're doing more volume, and you're trying to gain muscle. And then what you do from May and June is you run your strength focused training, and you peak then coming into July. So you're focused more on the lower rep ranges, and you're also focused on the skill of strength on the specific exercises. So for example, in your hypertrophy block, you might have done more front squatting or more safety bar squatting, whereas now as it comes up to the expression of the strength, you're going to do more of your specific competition squat or your preferred type of squat to try to train. So if you train, or if you try to maximize your 1 rep max using a low bar back squat, then that's what you would train leading up to the time that you're testing it. Whereas you could do front squats, safety bar squats, high bar squats, and so on further away from that period of time. So that's really important. Now, the other thing that is key is that when it comes to hypertrophy, you're thinking about the whole body. Okay, so you're asking yourself, for the type of strength that I'm trying to develop, what are the muscles that are going to contribute to strength? So for example, if you're trying to maximize your deadlift strength, you might train deadlifts and you might try to, just do loads of volume on deadlifts, but you also might focus on doing lots of RDLs, hip thrusts. You might do lots of shrugs. You might do lots of rows. So you're trying to hypertrophy the muscles that contribute to that lift, such as the traps, the lats, the glutes, the hamstrings, and so on. So you're trying to hypertrophy all the muscles that could potentially later on translate to specific strength contributions in that exercise. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to add? Or will I continue?
Oh, continue.
Perfect. That's all good. So that then brings us to something that's important on the hypertrophy side, but also kind of on the strength side. So what you can do when you're doing your hypertrophy blocks is use exercises that complement your standard strength exercises. So for example, you could use pause deadlifts to work on your control in the bottom position, your ability to maintain positioning while getting more volume for hypertrophy purposes. You might do Larsen presses, for example. So this is where your legs are up, to focus more on the upper body without using the force contribution from the lower body. You might do more front squats to focus more on your quads. All these different exercises can contribute to your hypertrophy, but can also complement your strength development and potentially bring up some of the weak points in your lifts. The other thing that this does, and this is really important in my area of coaching, is it gives you variety to your joints and to your muscles, and thus may potentially play a role in injury prevention. Because if we're constantly hammering the exact same movement patterns all the time and we're hyper specialized, that seems to be in most sports, and probably lifting, a risk factor for injury, because you're just constantly hammering the exact same movement pattern, exact same connective tissues, exact same small stabilizing muscles, and so on. Whereas if we can do slightly different exercise variations, we hit the muscles differently, we hit the joints differently, we hit the connective tissues differently, and as a result, we're distributing that force a bit better, rather than just constantly hammering the same position. So what that might look like is, let's say you're training for the bench press, that's your main focus. It doesn't mean you do all of your strength work, all of your hypertrophy work with just a flat bench press. You might do your flat bench press, but then you might have a day where you do incline barbell bench press, then you might do incline dumbbell press, flat dumbbell press, you might do weighted dips, all these different exercises, training similar muscles. And of course, we still want to have the flat bench press in there, especially as we're coming to the point of expressing that strength. but we can have variety, particularly within these hypertrophy blocks where the goal is muscle building and the goal is to get some more variety in. All good?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, yeah, I think a lot of people think that there are some magical exercises that they're missing out on that are going to like
Mm-hmm.
massively increase their strength or their muscle building or whatever. And like it's very, very often, or very rarely, I should say, the case that that is true. You know, like yes, there are definitely certain exercises that you're going to see a really nice return on investment for because they train a certain attribute or a certain part of the movement that you're struggling with or whatever, right? But too many people think that they're missing out on a special exercise or a magical exercise. That if I just knew that exercise or if I was able to perform the movement in a certain way, it would overcome all my problems. Like you see this on the bench press all the time where people will talk about like, oh, I have a sticking point at a certain point, you know, and I really need to train around like improving that sticking point. And very often it's just a case of, unfortunately, that's just the way your body is set up. That's just your biomechanics. You know, it's like that bottom portion of the lift is going to be challenging for you if you have very long arms, you know, if you're basically being put into this incredibly stretched position. And it might not be a sticking point for someone else because they have these little short T-Rex arms, you know, like if we just standardize the bench press for elbow position, all of a sudden half of these sticking points just magically go away, you know. But obviously that's harder to standardize then because it's not touching the chest for a lot of people, you know. But having said that, there very often are exercises that can really help you develop certain parts of a lift or really contribute a lot to a lift. Like I have a few clients that I'm thinking of right now that yeah, they just really weren't able to develop their quads and just due to their like biomechanics or whatever. And as a result, they found that squatting, you know, never really targeted their quads, right? Their quads were underdeveloped, they were weaker. So we did a few blocks of training where we really focused on improving quad strength, improving like positioning in a kind of like a squat movement. And now that they've gone back to squatting, all of a sudden they're like, wow, I actually really feel my quads working in this. I'm able to stay more upright. I'm able to actually use my quads in this movement, right? So the fact that we had spent a block of time really working on quad strength then carried over into the squat movement that they wanted to use. They just enjoyed the movement, but they were able to get more from that movement as a result of building up the skill of using their quads, you know? So again, there are no magical exercises, but that doesn't discount the fact that we can use certain exercises to improve certain lifts and you can get a lot from specific exercises.
Check. And that brings me to another area that's definitely important in the clients that I work with, which is prehab slash rehab work. Okay, so obviously, if you're training for strength all the time, there is some risk of you getting injured. And one of the things that I try to do is, as mentioned in the last section, we try to have variety and we try to train the muscles and the joints and the connective tissues with different angles, different resistance profiles, and so on. So that's a core principle. The other core principle is that we don't want to just keep adding more weight and keep adding more load indefinitely. So we want to have periods of time where training is a little bit easier. We want to have sets where we're a little bit further from failure. And that all just comes down to basic load management. If you're constantly trying to add weight to the bar every single week and you're allowing your technique to slip with maximal weights, that's just not great from an injury prevention perspective. Okay. Other things you might then do is if you have specific weak points, you might have specific strengthening that you do for them. For example, maybe you find that you're constantly getting triceps tendinopathy or elbow pain associated with your bench press. So you could do additional exercises to complement that. For example, you might do tempo close grip bench press where you focus more on the triceps, or you might have some skull crushers that you do to make sure that your elbows and your triceps are staying strong, or push downs, or whatever it happens to be. Similar thing could be said for your low back when it comes to deadlifting, or your quads when it comes to squatting, that you have certain exercises that just fill in those gaps for you and keep those injuries at bay or keep those tissues strong. What that looks like is kind of different for everyone because it depends on what you're actually struggling with. And in a lot of cases, it's not really about adding more specific exercises in. It ends up being more about how we distribute your volume throughout the week. So for example, if someone's having, let's say, that elbow problem, what I might get them to do is reduce their volume on the flat bench press, and we might do more volume than on dumbbell presses or machine chest presses where their elbows aren't at them as much, and we're still able to get the same total volume of work for the chest across the week and for pressing like movements, but we're just not putting it all through the exact same type of movement, and thus not getting the exact same problems when it comes to the elbow. And that applies to the shoulder, it applies to the knee, it applies to the hip, to the low back, and so on. So this depends on your own situation, but just note that you don't always have to be training these lifts like every single workout. Variation and load management are key principles, and that I'd say would take care of like 90% of the clients that I end up dealing with who have problems associated with lifting for strength.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. And then just that final point that we have with regards to the resistance training, and then we'll just quickly touch on cardiovascular training. You should practice as you aim to compete, right? We discussed this earlier on in terms of like if you're training for the 1 rep max, you need to practice 1 rep maxes. If you're training for a bench press with a pause, you need to train the bench press with a pause. Like, yes, you're going to get some carryover from like bouncing it off your chest, but it's not as specific as if you were training specifically for that. And this is important if you are aiming to compete in powerlifting. Like on the day, on competition day, you're going to be asked to train, well, effectively compete in a full body manner, right? You're going to be asked to compete in terms of you got your squat, you got your bench press, you got your deadlift, right? If you've never done that before, if you've always done something like I described earlier on, where you do a lower body day, then you do an upper body day, a lower body day, an upper body day, like you've missed out on the skill acquisition of training a full body, powerlifting completely. Like, I'm just practicing my lifts on this day. I'm just training those lifts on this day, right? Now, that might not be a problem, but you potentially do see issues arise. Like people will find, like, I don't know, for example, their lower back starts cramping up when they get to deadlifts. They've never, like, they basically identify a weakness or an issue because they've done their squats, obviously that, trains the lower back to a degree, and then they're doing their bench press, and especially if they have a huge arch on their bench press, like you're getting those erectors and everything into like these really shortened positions, and then you go to do your deadlift and all of a sudden you're knocking 20% off where you thought your strength was on the deadlift because you're fatigued from squatting, your low back, your erectors, everything are cramping up now, and you're just not able to express the strength that you already have because of the overall setup of the day, right? So there is a good argument to be made that you should integrate at least some, we'll call it like a full body training day into your overall programming if powerlifting is the goal. And this kind of applies to the cardiovascular stuff as well. Like if you are competing in powerlifting, especially if you're competing in certain federations that have, basically a day of lifting, like you're basically training all day. You're basically being asked to compete for 8 hours. That's not always the case, but you have to remember that is an endurance event as much as it is a strength event. Because if you're being asked to do your 1 rep max squat earlier in the day, and then your deadlift is not till fucking 3-4 hours later, again, this happens in certain federations, especially if there's a lot of lifters, like you have to be prepared for that, and some of that is just aerobic fitness. Some of it is obviously, specific nutrition protocols and hydration and fucking whatever else. But you can practice this. So if you are trying to be the best powerlifter possible, you probably should practice this.
I would agree. And you touched there on the concept of aerobic fitness. And this is something that is obviously neglected quite a bit by people that are training for strength. And I would say that my recommendations, even if you're competing in powerlifting, don't really change. I think that you should still be doing your aerobic work. I think it's really important for health. Obviously, I'm biased, we're biased because we talk about health a lot. But I think that, doing your, 150 minutes even, let's say, of moderate intensity aerobic work per week, I'm not convinced that's going to take away from your recovery from your powerlifting training or your adaptations in any way at all. It's relatively low intensity. You can do that kind of zone 2, 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. It's not going to take much away from you, and the aerobic fitness long term will one, certainly contribute to better health, but two, may contribute to better recovery between those sets of your powerlifting training and potentially to your endurance on these days when you are competing. So that's sort of speculative because we don't obviously have a lot of evidence on whether or not aerobic fitness makes any difference in powerlifting. But I think from a training longevity perspective, in particular, especially as you transition into your hypertrophy blocks where you need a bit more cardiovascular fitness, I think you get a bit more out of your training if you have a little bit more fitness. Okay. So I would still recommend that you do that. And of course, even at the base level, get in your steps each day. Powerlifters, their training is not, very energy intensive. Okay. The stronger you get, obviously, it becomes more energy intensive. But you should still be focusing on getting your 5, 7, 8, 10,000 steps, hopefully, per day. That would be ideal, especially from a health perspective.
Yeah, like I always, when I talk to like my powerlifting friends, or if I have clients that are interested in powerlifting or were previous powerlifters and they want to transition to more of a health focused, approach, I always have the discussion of like, right, if you are getting absolutely dusted off by a 5 rep set, like your lungs are burning, you like struggle to catch your breath after that, like that impacts your entire quality of life, right? Because walking up a stairs must be fucking awful for you, So even if we just improve your baseline level of fitness to what we would probably call like a normal level of fitness, like you're going to see massive improvements, maybe not in your sport, but in your general life and your ability to interact with the world, like some of my like powerlifting friends or whatever, like when I lived in Ireland, I lived beside a mountain, and we'd be like, oh yeah, let's go for a hike. And they'd be 4 minutes into the hike, struggling to breathe, And yeah, obviously that's a very specific situation. But if you can't interact with the world, like you can't go on a hike with your friends, like what the fuck is all the training for? Yeah, obviously you're going to be very strong, but you've only maximized one aspect of overall strength. Whereas there's people who are probably just as strong as you, who maybe even stronger than you, who also already have a baseline level of fitness. They're able to do both of those things. It's not like it detracts so much from your ability to train for absolute strength that it's just not worth it at all. It's probably very minimal, if any, impact on your overall strength or your ability to train powerlifting. The only thing is, obviously, it naturally enough takes some time. What I often recommend is just getting those baseline steps. Maybe it is you go for a couple of walks. Powerlifters are very resistant to this. So oftentimes I'll just be like, put on a weight vest, make it into a strength training thing, and powerlifters generally seem to be a bit more receptive to that. Just be like, all I want you to do is rack up 5,000 to 6,000 steps, 5,000 to 7,000, whatever it is, whatever makes sense for them per day. Just put on a 10-kilo weight vest. Once that gets too easy for you, use 15 kilos. Get to 20 kilos. It's just like make it into a strength focused thing for them, and all of a sudden you get some buy-in. So that is a little I don't know, cheat code that I often use.
Perfect. And that's a wrap on training for strength, I think.
Yeah.
Perfect. So guys, as always, if you enjoy the podcast, we appreciate when you share it. We appreciate when you recommend it to friends, and leave a rating and review if you can. If you'd like more from us, we do put out a weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to. You get exclusive content there. You get occasional offers as well, and content that you just won't find in our social media. If you don't use social media very much, you can also use the newsletter as a means to catch up on what we've produced throughout the week. So we give a roundup of all of our Instagram posts, our YouTube videos, and so on. And on that note, we do post a lot on YouTube these days. We have at least 3 new videos every single week, so make sure that you subscribe to keep up. The feedback has been great so far, and we hope to continue building our YouTube following and get lots of you educated through that platform. We have coaching spaces available as well, so if you're interested in our coaching service, do make sure that you get in touch. We have a form below that you can click and apply, and then you can work with a member of our expert coaching team. We also have our nutrition certification. There's one more week that you can sign up to the Triage Method Nutrition Cert and get certified as a nutrition coach. So if you'd like to get on that before the first intake closes, you can join this week, and then it will be closed for the following 6 months, at which point we'll be launching version 2. Just a note on that, if you do join, you will still have access to subsequent updates that we make. So don't feel like joining within the next week is in any way a disadvantage. If anything, it's better because you have more time to get through the initial content and then dig into any additional updates that we have.
Yeah, and also it'll likely be more expensive when we relaunch it,
Yes,
because
there is that.
naturally enough we will be updating it with lots more. So, it becomes more expensive. But yeah, I don't have anything else to add. I'll just reiterate that the intake does close on the 30th of June, I think it is, which is the Friday. And I know every single time we do this, and this sounds like a marketing tactic or whatever, but it's genuinely not. Every single time we have an end date of like, oh, intake closes on this date, or, this service ends or whatever on this date. The 3 or 4 days afterwards, we just get a load of messages from people being like, oh, I didn't realize it was closed on this date. Can I jump in? Oh, I thought it was X, Y, Z, like so many different things, and unfortunately we won't be able to let you in after it. Just the way the system, we have to work around the systems that we have. I can't just manually go, oh yeah, just jump in, So unfortunately, if you're out, if you missed the intake, you missed the intake. So don't miss it. Friday, I think it's the 30th. Just make sure you jump in.
Wonderful. And we'll see you in the next podcast, guys. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.